Hello, and welcome to Chapter 3 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, I will be discussing how neurons communicate with each other, the transmission of a neural impulse between two neurons. So as we reviewed in a previous video, this diagram kind of shows the propagation of a neural impulse between two neurons. And the connection, the junction between two neurons is called a synapse. It's where the axon terminal of one neuron connects with the soma or cell body or perhaps a dendrite of a second neuron. And so when we are referring to two neurons that are communicating, we often call one the presynaptic cell. It's the neuron that's carrying the neural impulse before it reaches the synapse, and then the postsynaptic cell, the cell that is carrying the neural impulse after the synapse. So this diagram shows the activity of certain chemicals and certain channels at the synapse. There's lots of information in this diagram. I've just highlighted and circled some of the terms that you should know at this stage in your learning. So I'll briefly walk through the various steps of what happens at the synapse and how one neuron communicates with another neuron. So the first step is that an action potential arrives at the axon terminal. So the action potential diagram that we reviewed in the previous video results in channels opening all the way down an axon. If it's myelinated, jumping from one node of Ranvier to the next until it reaches an axon terminal. And once the axon terminal reaches a certain voltage, it allows for the opening of voltage gated calcium channels. So very similar to the potassium channels as described previously, these voltage gated calcium channels only open at a specific voltage once the axon membrane becomes positive enough. And that allows calcium, which is highly concentrated on the outside of the cell, to come inside of the cell. And calcium's job at the axon terminal is to signal vesicles. Vesicles, once again, are packages in an animal cell that contain various chemicals. The vesicles in a neuron are called synaptic vesicles. They do their work at the synapse, and their job is to carry neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical substances that are released into the by the presynaptic neuron to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. So in this little diagram, you can see indicated here, the little purple triangles represent neurotransmitters. So once calcium rushes into the cell, it signals the vesicles to begin moving to the cell membrane at the synapse. And once vesicles get to the cell membrane, they bind with the membrane and release their contents into the synaptic cleft through a process called exocytosis. That's them binding with the membrane and letting go of their contents. And that way, neurotransmitters can be signaled to be released into the synaptic cleft and bind with proteins with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. So neurotransmitters bind with specific proteins that match their shape and function on the postsynaptic membrane, the postsynaptic neuron. And it's important to note that, as you can see here by this diagram, the receptors on the postsynaptic cell are ligand gated channels. So they only open to a specific neurotransmitter. So there's many different kinds of neurotransmitters that can be released, and certain neurotransmitters have one function, others have different functions. Certain neurotransmitters will cause the neural impulse to propagate further down the next neuron. Other neurotransmitters will weaken the transmission of that neural impulse. Uh, on this next slide, you'll see a brief diagram of some of the basic types of neurotransmitters, and the action of these neurotransmitters really determines how, from just a physiological level, how our brains work, how we are able to move our limbs, how we are able to have abstract reasoning and solve complex puzzles. It's really at a cellular basis basis, or a molecular basis, I should say, that these neurotransmitters have their effect and really determine the whole range of human functioning. And the most exciting thing is there's so much we don't know about the activity of these neurotransmitters at the synapse. Uh, this is the location of many drugs where they have their effects. It's the location of many forms of disease that we study. The synapse is really the kind of final frontier of brain research. So in the next video, I'll be discussing the various parts of the nervous system, how we think about and how we organize and how we study the nervous system.